We're going to think about metalwork next. And I've got a couple of different bits of metalwork for us to think about. So this is a silver-plated copper alloy object. This one is a ferrous metal object, and then this is another very much more obviously copper object. So copper, iron, and then this is an alloy of different metals. So it appears to be a white metal, but underneath it's a yellow metal. So you've got potentially two different things going on there. So with metal, as always, whether in an emergency situation or not, you want to be wearing gloves to protect the object. You need to ensure that with metal objects that might be complex, for example, chandeliers, that you check the priority object sheet to ensure that you know exactly how it's constructed, any fixings that you need to be aware of. Those are the kind of metal objects that are most likely to be more complicated to get out when they're sort of fixtures and fittings rather than standalone objects. If you are packing smaller objects into a crate, you need to make sure that they're separated from each other, and they can be packed together in a crate, and then you can use acid-free tissue paper or bubble wrap to separate them. And again, metals can be quite heavy, so it's important again to use any moving equipment that is needed to protect yourself as well as the object, whether that's straps or trolleys, slings, anything like that, because yeah, if you drop something heavy and metal on yourself, it will hurt, probably will hurt you more than the object, in fact, so that's why it's really important. So in terms of hazards, metals can be heavy. Some metals might be linked to an electricity supply because of the nature of what they are. If you protect objects in situ, for example with bubble wrap or polythene, and it gets wet, then you have the potential for corrosion developing. And on a really basic level, if metals have been in a place where there's been a fire, they can become really hot. So that's an issue. And in the same way, you've also got lead, that if lead flashing, say, in a hot building, that can melt, and lead can get into the building that way, and then you've got a massive decontamination problem on your hands. So if you know that you're salvaging from an area where lead may have become hot and then it may have been partially washed into the building through the through fire starting, and then the attempt to battle the fire, then yeah, that can make the problem a lot bigger. So lead can be a problem whether you're talking about a small object or part again of the fixtures and fittings of a building itself. Order of removal, obviously, if you've got things on your priority object list, that should go first, and then if you've then got time, everything else. The other thing to consider is, again, door furniture. There might be some really nice door furniture that we want to try and get out from places, so that's another thing to consider. Anything that's fixed or large should be left in situ, ideally against the wall and covered in polythene or dust sheets. If they can be moved, obviously, if they can't be moved, then you just cover them where they are, but only use polythene on a very short-term basis because of the risk of corrosion, because water can eventually kind of get in underneath, and then you end up with a bigger problem of corrosion as well as just wet metal. So if you do get something like this wet, it can just be blotted dry with kitchen towel, but again, dab, don't rub, because with some metals, not necessarily with iron, but with you know, something that's silver plated or copper, that can abrade quite easily, so you do want to make sure that you're just dabbing, not rubbing. If there's an applied finish, again, so say you've got a painting like an enamel on copper or something, then you don't want to be touching that. because you might damage it. Or we do also have some things that might be a copper alloy or a tin that has been painted, and if water has got in, then you're quite likely to end up with the paint layer flaking. So again, you want to just allow that to air dry on its own, but you do want to air dry it fairly quickly if it's just metal on its own, in which case it's quite good to put it in a wind tunnel. If it has any organic elements, so say actually you've got something like this where you've got metal elements and then the organic element, you want that to air dry slowly because you don't want the wood to deform due to having dried too fast. Whereas if it's just metal on its own, you want to dry that as quickly as possible to avoid any corrosion developing. And also, if you do have anything small like these, they could also go into a plastic box, like a really useful box, with some silica gel. So you've got some cassettes here, and that will also help them to dry out in that sort of sealed environment. So I mean, something like this might be quite a good candidate for that if you're concerned that the moisture is getting trapped in the engraving, whereas something like this you probably dry it fairly easily. Yeah, it allows you to dry something out in a fairly controlled way, but it can only really be done with small things, obviously. Because we can't make a sealed unit for anything very, very big. Again, if metal objects are dry, then they're probably okay. You want to make sure that they go to the dry area, keep them dry, wrap them if necessary and protect them, pack them in labelled crates, and then store them in a safe place. Ideally with a lower relative humidity. You don't want it to be somewhere too damp because then you might end up with the corrosion growth happening anyway. But just to point out that something like this, where you've got the silver plating, then you're going to get black or brown tarnish on it. But because you've also got a copper alloy base, then you might also see a development of green corrosion. With this, because it is just copper, you've got black tarnish developing. But again, you could end up with the green powdery corrosion products. And then, of course, this is iron, so you're going to get ferrous corrosion, which is orange rust that we're all most familiar with. And finally, if it's something that is lead, then if you do see lead corrosion, that's like white and powdery, that's really hazardous. So put that to one side. Don't try and do anything with that. Get a conservator to deal with it, or just put it in a box and seal it and label it and say that there is lead corrosion, because if you inhale it, it is bad for you. How quickly does corrosion start? So if you have lots of metal objects to deal with, which ones should you prioritise first? Ones that have got like a more obviously damaged surface, corrosion is more likely to develop there. It can happen as quickly as sort of 48 hours. Same with mold growth, can start really quickly as well. But I think I would still prioritise the objects that are priorities, and you know things that are sort of, if they are a priority object, then start with that. If you've got a lot of things that are wet, but you know that, say, you know, we've got plenty of other sugar tongs in the store, then you know you could possibly leave that, but they wouldn't take that long to dry anyway if you're just dabbing them dry. Is what I would say, is just start with the ones that you know are the actual priority objects. And also, if you know you've got priority objects that are made of mixed materials, so say a piece of furniture that's got metal and wood, say, then you might want to just make sure that you dry off the metal elements first, make sure that those are dry, and then let the rest of it dry slowly.